we've gone through in these nights of hope, a hope for restoration, a hope for peace, and tonight we're going to encounter a hope for change. How many of you like change in life? You like things just kind of switched up? I didn't think so. You're like, why would we do a hope for change? This makes no sense. But how many of you, despite your dislike for change to have, you're longing for something to be different in your life? Let's put it that way. That there's a longing in your heart for a change to occur. Something would be different. I don't know what that is for you. I got some things on my own heart, my own mind. I'll keep them to myself for right now. But you know what that is. You know that the change is possible when God intervenes, that He wants to do something miraculous. So whatever is on your heart and whatever you're thinking about in that, I just pray that God meets you where you're at. And I just ask that you just focus in on that. God, what do you want to change for me? And possibly start talking to Him about the things that you long to change in your life. And so I will say, and maybe we can get more hands up than what was up there before. I know people don't like change. I kind of expected that. But how many of you know that grace changes everything? Grace changes everything. So when we think about the hope for change, to be honest with you, earlier this week, I had a completely different thought for a message, like in my head. I was like, hope for change. Like, we've got to go out with the authority that God has given us, and we got to conquer, and we got to create the change. And literally, I'm barely opening my eyes up Monday morning. Those little crusties in your eyes that you wake up with after a good night's sleep. And I'm just barely opening my eyes up, and my first thought was, God, what are we going to do for Sunday? And it was immediate, which was awesome. But He just gave me one word. He said, grace. And I was like, no, that ruins my plans. I wanted to go out and conquer. I wanted to go out and tell everybody about the authority that Jesus granted us. And we have the power to trample. We have the power to change the atmosphere. And He's like, no, grace. Grace. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to obey, because that's probably the best thing to do in all of this is obey. And so we're going to go over how grace changes everything. Now, going, in the process of change in life, it's like Noel tells stories about how he ran a marathon. He's ran a few more half marathons. And there's a point when you get into those long distance runs that you hit a wall. And it's like, do I continue or do I just bow out right now, because it's really hard and I just don't know if it's going to get any better or not? And so we find that in life. The things that we hope for change in our life, the things that we're asking God to change in our life, at some point, we probably hit a wall. And we go, is it worth it to hold out hope anymore that God is actually going to make a change in my life? That He's going to change my circumstances, that He's going to change my relationship, that He's going to change my finances. These everyday things that go on in our life. Is He going to make a change in my health? Like the things that we're so hopeful for in life that we want Him to change, we hit the wall and we go, is this really possible? Now, we go into a world and a culture right now where, change is just about, it's really available, actually, any way, form you want it. Like, if you want to change your health, there's about 1.5 billion diets that you can go choose from, and you can go down that route. And we have relationship experts out there that help you create change in your relationships and your friendships. We have career coaches out there who help you make a change in that. But when it comes to stuff in our spiritual life, we don't have that I guess you would call it human interaction, where we can look to some coach or expert to do this, and we have to rely, guess what, on our relationship with God and to hear His voice throughout this process. And a lot of us get stuck real quick when it comes to stuff and change and the things we're longing God to work in our life, because we can't hear His voice in this whole matter. And so my prayer right now is that you would hear His voice tonight. You would hear His voice speak over you, however soft or loud that He wants to do it in, and that He begins to say, listen, you do have a hope for a change in your life, and I'm here to show you how and why that's possible. And it's going to be a little bit different, I think, at least the way God revealed it to me, and I'm going to explain it, than maybe we're expecting here. And so when we're talking about getting our prayer life more in sync on a daily basis, when we're talking about wanting to read our Bible more, how many of you start a Bible plan, like on the YouVersion Bible app, and you get a few days into it, and then you kind of forget about it, or you're like, well, I skipped a few days, now why would I just bother even finishing? You hit that wall spiritually. Is it just me? I've got 50 plans that I haven't finished on there because I've just okay, let's start a new one right now. Start over fresh. But we hit that wall. We hit that wall spiritually. And I was telling the team before when we were huddled up, we've gone through a hope for restoration, where we've been hoping that God would restore something in our past, where we found out He actually wants to restore something in us. And then last week we went for a hope for peace, and we realized that the presence of God produces peace in ways that we can't even begin to comprehend. And so I was thinking these past couple of weeks, okay, we're on this road. We're restoring our life. We're getting things back in order. Now we got this peace. I bet you we're wanting and hoping that something's going to change in our life spiritually. It just makes sense. And sometimes we just hit that wall spiritually and we just don't know what to do. For me, change and growing more spiritually, a big thing that happened for me a few years ago was I got a revelation and then quickly a conviction about following the Sabbath, taking a Sabbath day for myself. I am a workaholic in progress. And so I would work 24/7. If they had 8 days, I'd work 24/8. If they have 50 hours, I would work 50 hours. It's just not a good, healthy thing. I've gotten a little bit better, and it's okay. I don't need to, I do see somebody for it. So anyway, beyond that, coaching is good in life. I'll tell you that. I got a revelation through some stuff I was reading in the Bible, some teachings from some pastors on the Sabbath. And we know it's one of the 10 Commandments. But for some reason, that one is just kind of easy to put to the side. Don't lie. Don't serve any other gods. Don't covet. Don't murder. We got those in check. But for some reason, it's just kind of easy to say, Sabbath, I don't know much about that, so it's not a big deal. But it's one of the commandments. And I got, like I said, a revelation and a conviction. And so the first time I ever purposely took a Sabbath, going to make this a priority in my life, it was the weirdest experience. I was more stressed out that day and anxious that day, to be honest with you, because I sat down going, what do I do? There's nothing to do. And so I'm asking God, make a change in my life, but I'm stressed out about it. I'm like, is it really worth it? Is it really going to happen? And long story short, working through all of that, my favorite day of the week now is my Sabbath. The day I shut everything down. The day it's just me and God, enjoyment in life. And I tell you, that was a work in progress, but change needed to happen in my life spiritually to draw closer to God. And whatever that is for you, let's take a journey on with that today. If you'll go with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're gonna read about Paul's thorn in his side here. Chapter 11, he's just been boasting about what God has done in his life because he's been shipwrecked, he's been stoned, he's been sought after, taken to prison, he's being beaten, all this stuff, and he goes, look what God's done for me. And then we come to verse 1 of chapter 12, and he says this, I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I'll refrain from it. I'll refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. That's something to write down right there. That's important. So to keep me from being conceited, listen to this. Keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. A thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that he should leave me. But he said to me, Jesus said this to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, I'm strong. For when I'm weak, I'm strong. Now, Paul gets this thorn and is a messenger from Satan to torment him, to mess up his life. And he goes, God, I really need this to go away. Will you please take this away from me? Now, I don't know if you've ever had something that you're asking God to do for you, to change in your life, and it's kind of like crickets. It's silent a little bit, and you really don't know what's going on. And we don't get an answer from Jesus in this saying yes or no. He just says, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient. Now, to be honest, that's lovely. That sounds lovely. Like, my grace is sufficient for you. But it's almost like Jesus, and he's not, but it's almost like he's dodging the answer, the question, because he doesn't give the yes or no answer. I'll take care of it, or no, that you have to endure this. He goes, my grace is sufficient for you. It's like poetic, in a sense. It's like the perfect answer from God. My grace is sufficient for you. And I'm like, well, that's awesome, God, but I really need some answers right now in my life, because this thing that I want changed in my life is not happening. And so, yeah, you say your grace is sufficient, but I don't know. I need an answer, yes or no. Are you going to make this happen? Is it going to change in my life? No. I like the word in here where he says that it backed up a little bit. You don't have to go there, but he says that he pleaded with God. And there's just certain words, to be honest with you, that they catch my eye, they catch my ear. Like, he pleaded. What is up with that? Like, sounds like he's begging God. It sounds like it's a pretty intense situation. He's pleading with God. And so I wanted to look that word up, and once I looked that up, I wanted to share it with you guys. So the word pleaded in the Greek here is parakaleo. Parakaleo. And it's formed of 2 words. The first word is para, meaning close or beside, and kaleo means to call. To make a call from being up close and personal. Now, I'll put it this way to help us understand what make a call up close and personal means. Imagine you're at a baseball game. You ever been to a baseball game before? Okay, there's a play at the plate, and the guy you wanted to score, he's called out, and the whole stadium just goes boo, boo, like they're beside themselves because they know it was safe. Are you going to trust the person that's 200 feet away, or an ump who's so close, right there, that he's going to make the call? So this is what we're referring to, and we put these 2 words together, and we got parakaleo, which means it's to personally make a call, and it refers to believers offering up evidence that stands up in God's court. Evidence that stands up in God's court. Actually, in the Greek, this is a legal term in a sense. And so we go to God and we say, God, please make a change. Please do something in my life. And we don't hear the yes. And it confuses us because we're taught that proclaim God's word in faith. In faith, ask God and it'll be given to you. And we're pleading our case. We're like taking evidence to God's court and saying, I'm doing the things that you've taught me to do, God. I'm proclaiming your word. I'm taking away my will. I'm saying it's all in your will. I'm lining up my thoughts and my heart with you. Like, this is evidence that, God, you should do this. You should move on my behalf. We're putting evidence to God. Yet, Paul's situation, God goes, my grace is sufficient for you. Meaning, I'm not going to do this. And it's like, God, this doesn't make sense. I really want this to change in my life, but you're just saying that your grace, it's sufficient. Okay, I'll go with that for right now. Now, this whole thing with grace, we've got to understand. We said earlier, grace changes everything, and it does. It does. And it says his grace is sufficient. Sufficient, like if you go to a dictionary, it means that it has everything to meet the need right there and then. Everything to meet the need. So when he says, my grace is sufficient, he's saying, my grace is everything you need in the time that you're in right now. What you're going through, what you want changed right now, you may not get the answer that you're looking and hoping for, but I got to tell you, everything you need is found in the form of grace right now. It's found in my grace, and it's going to be sufficient for you. And so he continues on, and he's going through this thing, and he's talking about weakness and all this stuff, and that we'll get into that in just a moment. But to take it back a little bit, and we go back just a bit here. Bear with me here. I want to make sure I don't miss anything on this. And we go back and we talk about God's sovereignty in this. And like I just said, he's going to say what he's going to say regardless of us making a call or not. He goes back into the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God in being able to make the call. But then we go into God's sufficiency and understanding that everything he has for us, we are able to get that right now to get us through this. But the question remains, how are we really going to understand God's sovereignty in all of this? It's not enough sometimes as human beings to go, okay, God, I'm just really going to trust. Sometimes we want to understand how God works. How does this whole grace thing play out in our life? Like what takes place in all of it? And I want to get into just a little bit of a teaching mode, because when I read this and studied this, it was just really profound for me. Go with me real quick to Titus chapter 2. I don't know if you ever go and read Titus. It's a very short book. It's almost like, did we miss it? So it's next to the Timothy's if you want to go into the New Testament, or you can look on the screen right there. Titus chapter 2. I want to tie this all in real quick on how God's grace is sufficient for us and how it actually plays out in our life. So chapter 2 of Titus, starting in verse 11, it says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ." Here we go, verse 14, pay attention to this. "Who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works." For people of his own possession. This is one of those words that I'm like, for some reason, dive more into this. And so again, I went to the Greek on this to find out Strong's Concordance. Like, what does the word possession mean? And there's another Greek word, and it's a little bit hard to pronounce, so if anybody's online, you want to correct me, forgive me and all of that. But it's perisiosos. And it comes from two words again, peri, meaning all around, and enai, to exist. And when you put it together, it comes out like this. It's of one's own possession. And this describes the believers because they belong to the Lord as his prized treasure, his own unique possession. Now, why are you bringing this up, Ryan? I want to show us a little bit how grace works in this. And if we can get this on the circle here to explain this kind of more in a visual sense here. So this is God on the outside. We're this dot on the inside. Okay? And this word possession in Titus 2:14 is talking about how God has us as his unique possession all to himself. Meaning he is around us, he's guarding us, he wants us for himself. He doesn't want anything else to interfere with us being his. He's a jealous God. He's zealous for us. And so when we're thinking about the stuff that comes in our life that is hindering the change we want to take place in our life, and we don't understand why God doesn't give us a yes or no answer, and he's just saying, my grace is sufficient for you, we can look at it this way. as if a temptation was to come into our life, for example. A temptation comes into our life. You all get tempted sometimes in different ways. We all do. And so a temptation comes in life. But as God's unique possession, his prized possession, who takes care of us, who watches over us, in order for that temptation to get to us, it has to go through God. It first has to go through God. And it makes a little more sense if we go into 1 Corinthians 10:13. We probably know this verse, but it says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, so that you may be able to endure it." So we put this back together with this verse and this visual aid here, and we see that in order for a temptation to come to us, it has to go through the will of God first. And he does stuff throughout this to make sure that, number one, we're not tempted beyond what we can bear, that we're able to endure it. And so if we look at it that way, we get this idea of how God works in our life. He's protecting us from things that maybe aren't good for us. Go to this next example. We can throw in, instead of temptation, we can throw in a trial that we face in life. And again, kind of the same thing, that if there's a trial that's going to enter our life, if God has us as his unique prized possession, in order for that trial to reach us, it has to go through the will of God. It has to go through his way, his say, and all of this stuff. To put it into, I know this is a little bit out of the box and maybe a little bit deep, but if we go into this, there's three points to this. 3 points to this to help us understand this. God in his wisdom plans the test, and he limits the trial. And then God in his love sends the test and permits the trial. And God in his grace meets the test, and he overcomes the trial. So let's put the circle back up there with these 3. And when you think about the trials or your temptations in your life, this is the grace of God over our life. God in his wisdom, because he wants us all to himself. Meaning that the world, the sin that we live in, he wants that gone. And so he will send temptations, he will send trials our way, not to persecute us, not to bring us down, but because we are his unique, prized possession, and he doesn't want anything else hindering what is his. And so he will send trials in our life. In his wisdom, he plans them. And he'll send the test. But it's got to go through him first, so he will limit the trial. So in his wisdom, he plans it, and then he sends it through his love, because he loves us so much. He doesn't want us to stay where we're at. He does want the change to take place. Maybe it's not exactly the change you're hoping for, but he does want change to take place. And so he permits the trial. And then in his grace, he meets it and he overcomes it. So before this even reaches you, before the temptation, before the trial ever even reaches you, it has gone through God's wisdom. It has gone through his love. It has gone through his grace. So when it gets to you, it's there to benefit us, not to knock us down. And so he says, my grace is sufficient for you. Because, yeah, I planned it in my wisdom. I sent it because I love you, and I don't want anything to hinder our relationship. But guess what? My grace is so good before it even reaches you. I have met the trial, and I have overcome it. I have overcome it. That is powerful. That is powerful. God wants us to himself. And we're asking him, God, this is something I want changed in my life. I'm throwing out all this evidence as to why it should change. It's not changing. Why is this not happening in my life? We've got to look at it in a different perspective, in a different light. That God is more concerned with us and our relationship with him. And yes, he cares about what you're going through, but he wants to use what you're going through to make the changes, to make you more into the image of his Son. I think Galatians 5:20 is next. We know this. When I've been crucified with Christ, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me. He gave himself for me. I've been crucified with Christ. I've been set free from the things in my life. I've been set free from the sin, the condemnation, the things that have held me back in life. And my gift as a Christian is I get to be conformed into the image of God's own Son. That's awesome. But it gets in the way of the things we want to change in our life sometimes, because in our finite minds, we're just like, God, this would be really good for me. I think according to your word, this is what you want for me. And I really want it to happen. And God's like, I've got something more important at hand. And if you'll just take a step back and realize that my grace is sufficient for you in the moment right now, you're going to be able to endure it. It may not feel like it. It may feel like you're being overcome in some way, but you're going to be able to endure it because my grace is going to reach out to you. It's going to reach out to you. But going back to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he goes on to say, after Jesus has told him, my grace is sufficient for you, get this. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power, God's power, is made perfect in weakness. In weakness. And that just, it's like, okay, God, so if you just want me to be weak so your power can come upon me and it's made perfect, should I just stop what I'm doing? Should I just give up hope for the change that's in my life and just be weak? It's not what he's saying at all in this. He's saying that his power, his strength, is going to meet however weak, feeble, just beat in our heart, in our mind, that the hope is for change is not going to happen. He's going to meet us right then and there. And his power is going to supplement everything that we're missing. It's like the puzzle pieces once again. It's like you're missing that one piece and you can't put it together. But in all of this, God says, okay, guess what? I've got my strength. I've got my power. I'm going to connect it to what you have. And it may be weak right now. It may not be strong. It may not be built up the way you want it to be built up. But in this, I'm going to connect it. It's going to come together. And so then we can go and we can use God's word to proclaim God's promises over our life, and we see it in a different light now. Because when we see Philippians 4:13 and we can say, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, now we're saying it from this place of, okay, God, if you've got the trial and you've permitted it to come into my life and you've met it, and you've already overcome it before it even reaches me, then yeah, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Guess what? In my weakness, I'm going to let the power of God come in and overshadow all of this weakness and link up with it and make it a perfect joint effort team, because anything that comes against me, I can do all things because God has already done it for me. We say things like Romans 8:37. We're more than conquerors. We're more than conquerors through him who loved us. Why are we more than conquerors? It's not necessarily because we walk with this authority. We have it, but it is because of God's grace that he has done something different in our life, and we can say that we're more than conquerors because when the trial and temptation has come in our life, his grace is already sufficient and has met it and has overcome it, and that has made us conquerors. Okay? We often say a phrase, what the enemy meant for evil, God did for or turned to good. And we find that actually in Genesis 50, verse 20, when Joseph is talking to his family. He says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You got to wonder, the story of Joseph's life, prison, the pit, slavery, all these different things, I bet you he was wanting change in his life. And I can guarantee you, those lonely nights in prison, he's got to have this thought, really, God, your grace is sufficient for me? Like, do you have anything else for me? I want out of here. I want to do something different in my life. But guess what? Now we can look at what the enemy's meaning to do as evil. God has already come, and he's permitted it to come through here, and before it reaches us, we're changed. We're changed. We're changed. Not just our circumstances, but we are changed. Because God's grace is sufficient to surmount any difficulty, to comfort any sorrow, and to overcome any obstacle that would ever come our way. So whatever obstacle is in your way of the change that you're hoping for God to make in your life, God's grace is sufficient for it. Any sorrow, any heartache that you're feeling right now, and you want something to change, that's causing you this pain, God's grace is sufficient in this. Because if it's at your feet right now, if it's in your life, if you're feeling it, if you're thinking it, God in his wisdom planned it. God in his love sent it. God in his grace has met it. And he's going to overcome all of it so that not only are the circumstances in our life changed through all of this, we are changed. We are changed. We are changed. I know I've been going on for a quick minute here. I want to give us 3 points. We can just jump ahead to 3 points here. I'll connect the dots here to end this. He goes on to say, therefore I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I'm weak, I'm strong. We really want true, lasting change in our life. The kind that not only gets us through our circumstances, that we're pleading and begging and throwing up evidence to God that he would change in our life. We first have to get to the place, number one, we admit our weaknesses. And that's huge. That's huge. Paul says, I was given this thorn because if it didn't happen, I would be conceited. Ooh, that's big. That's big. And he admits that he's got a weakness. Paul, we throw him up to be this super apostle, and he was a great guy. He did a lot. I don't anybody else do more than that? I don't know. But obviously, he had a pride issue because these revelations that God was giving him, he was like, if this wasn't in my life, if God wasn't so gracious to send me this thorn in my side, if he didn't plan the test in his wisdom, if he didn't love me enough to send it to me, if he now in his graciousness helps me endure it and overcome it, if he didn't send this, I would be a conceited man. If we don't admit, first of all, our weaknesses, we're going to try to hide them from God. We're going to try to hide them from other people. We're going to come across as someone maybe who we're not supposed to be. If Paul would have been conceited, how effective do you think he would have been in his ministry? And so if we don't admit our weaknesses to God and just lay them out there, admit them to one another, we're missing this first step in saying that God, I've got to be humble in this. It says in James 4:10, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. If we don't get to this place of humility and being able to work and admit our weaknesses, we're stuck. We're stuck. Because the next thing builds upon that. Paul says, not only am I going to admit my weakness here, but I'm going to boast about my weakness. Now, for me, who tries everything to look anything but weak, and I think we're all in that boat at some level, we don't want to appear weak. He's saying, guess what? I'm going to talk about how weak I am. I'm going to boast about these things. I'm going to give praise and honor to God that, guess what? In my weakness, his strength is going to come upon me. And so it just takes it to a whole other paradigm, a whole other shift in our thinking to go, wait a minute, I am weak in this. I'm going to admit this. And because of how good God is and how he's going to meet everything in this, I'm going to boast about it. I am going to talk about my weaknesses so God can get shown off here. We could talk about how great and how good God really is. Because that's what he's boasting about in here. He's not boasting for his own sake. He's boasting about all the things that God has done through him, for him, in all of this. And we can't get to that place unless, first of all, we admit our weaknesses, but then we can just start boasting about our weaknesses, proclaiming the goodness of God and all that. That leads us to the third point, which is we're going to be content in our weaknesses. And this is the hard one. Because sometimes in our weaknesses, there's no expiration date. We like to think that we're going to get strong in a certain area. We never get word that this thorn was removed from Paul. Maybe later on in a letter that we just don't have in the Bible that he wrote to somebody. Guess what? Praise report. Thorn is gone. We don't read about it. And yes, we want to be strong in all things, but it's okay to be weak. It's okay to struggle in some things, because when we admit that, God's strength rests upon us. And we can strive for all this change that we want in life and this thing that we're hoping for in our life. Or we can just go, God, I don't know how this is going to work out. I admit I'm weak in this area, God. But I'm going to boast about it. I'm going to be happy about it, because guess what? I know through my weakness, you're going to do something really amazing in all of this. And you're going to get the glory for this. And through that, I'm going to be made more into the image and likeness of your Son. I'm going to mature as a believer. But even if I don't become strong in this area, even if nothing changes, Paul says I'm going to be content in my weakness. I'm going to be content. Sometimes there's not an expiration date with that. Sometimes the weakness doesn't go away. But he says I'm going to be content. And I'm going to trust God that whatever he sent my way, that he's got it all figured out, and that his grace is sufficient in the moment for all of it. And so wherever you're at right now in your walk with God, whatever you came in with hope for change in your life, I hope at least you've gotten a little bit of a different perspective on how God works through things in life. Sometimes we don't understand the why. Sometimes it's out of our understanding that why God, why is this happening? Why is this not changing? But to understand how God works on our behalf, because he loves us so much, because we are his unique possession, because he wants more of us unto him. He wants more sin out of our life. He wants more glory in our life. That he will sometimes permit things to be stalled in ways that we don't understand. But I can guarantee you, if you're challenged with something right now, it didn't come to you by itself. It came through the sovereignty of God. And if he's allowed it to come into your life, he's given enough grace for us to overcome it in our life, to be content with it in life.